Welcome back, players. I'm Jacko36Cancel, and this is Coco the Weiss Cat. And Coco here is 6 years old, but Weiss Schwarz has actually been around a fair bit longer. In fact, the first Weiss Schwarz products that came to English came all the way back in 2009, and they were the Disgaea trial decks. Later, in 2012, 2013, and 2014, booster boxes from the first English Weiss Schwarz titles like Madoka Magica, Fate Zero, Angel Beats, Bakemonogatari, and OG Sword Art and Love Live hit the stage, so now the English game is over a decade old. Weiss Schwarz is originally from Japan, and the Japanese Weiss Schwarz game just had its 15th anniversary. Now, many card games come and go, so this is a pretty incredible lifespan for an anime TCG. But as you might imagine, things have changed a lot in a decade. And of course, I'm talking about power creep. Power creep in card games is the idea that cards printed today are strictly better than cards printed yesterday. Okay, not literally, and not always, but as games progress, you do see a pattern. Basically, power creep means that a card that's maybe a few years old now has a similar card printed today, which happens to be that old card, but better. For example, a common drop searcher in Weiss Schwarz circa 2012 was a 1500 power level 0 that did nothing but drop search. And now we have drop searchers that bounce, that get power, that give other characters power, and some that even do it twice. So, more powerful cards and effects have crept into the game. Now, this isn't a bad thing. If cards didn't get better and more interesting as the years passed, nobody would want to play after a while. So all TCGs engage in power creep as the design progresses. Most of the time, this is kept under control to a point where the game is very playable, and the power scaling is pretty innocuous. However, sometimes it means that your cards get so good and the game gets so degenerate that you have to reboot your game 3 fucking times to try to get it under control. Now, many other games separate themselves into formats, some of which only newer cards are legal, and some in which you can play anything. This means that you can kind of go through periods where, as older cards rotate out of different formats, the newer cards don't necessarily have to be better than the old ones. Standard Magic is a great example of a format like this, but Weiss Schwarz is different. Aside from a few card restrictions, you can play absolutely anything from any set, so you can play the oldest Weiss Schwarz cards against the newest ones at the highest tables. Being that this is the case, newer Weiss Schwarz cards generally only get more powerful as the game goes on in order to stay ahead of what's old news and keep players engaged and, of course, buying new cards. And oh boy, have things come a long way in that time. So in this video, and some videos that I'll be making as parts of a new mini-series, I'm going to take a look back and see how Weiss Schwarz cards have grown in power over the years. Originally, I had a massive script and video plan for this, but it was just a mess, so I decided to break it into nice, bite-sized parts. And for this first installment, I want to talk about Brainstormers. Brainstormers and Weiss Schwarz are generally level 0s that allow you to pay cost and then put some number of cards from the top of your deck into your waiting room, usually around 4 or 5. Then, if you see a climax among those cards, or sometimes other specified cards, you get to search, salvage, top check, or sometimes perform some other different effect. Brainstorms are integral to most Weiss Schwarz decks because they're a method of adding cards to your hand that you need and moving through your deck. But today's Brainstormers look nothing like the Brainstormers of early Weiss Schwarz. So let's go back to 2014, the first year Weiss Schwarz had posted results and deck lists for its regional tournaments, and see what things looked like back then. And once we do, we'll move through the progression of Brainstormers until we reach today so we can see just how powerful newer Brainstormers are compared to what they once were. Now, believe it or not, back in 2014, a lot of placing Weiss Schwarz decks didn't even run Brainstormers. Some didn't even run Climax combos. But if they did, they looked something like this Silica from the original Sword Art Online booster. She's 2500 power, and you can pay 1 and rest 2 of your characters to brainstorm, and then salvage a character for each climax you hit, and that is all she does. Imagine having to rest 2 characters to brainstorm, especially in a time period where adding cards to your hand wasn't as easy as just attacking with the right climax in play. In fact, SAO is one of the only early Weiss Schwarz sets that even had a level 1 advantage combo, but we'll talk about those in another video. Another Brainstormer that existed back then was Never-Ending Song Hatsune Miku. Now, she only had to rest herself, but her brainstorm ability was just to draw a card. She also had another ability where you could pay 1 to draw and discard as many times as you could pay for it. This was actually a very interesting Brainstormer back then, but of course, drawing cards is generally a lot worse than just searching or salvaging what you need. In the early years of the game, there were other weirder Brainstormers. There were some Brainstormers that added plus 2k for each climax you hit, or gave a character plus 1 soul for each climax, and some that were level 1 instead of level 0. A lot of these were, even back then, considered absolutely terrible, though most Weiss Schwarz titles featured at least one Brainstormer that kind of looked like Silica from earlier, where you rested 2 characters to brainstorm and either searched or salvaged. Now, in the coming years, Brainstormers, of course, started to get better. In 2015 and 2016, most Brainstormers that had to res 2 characters now had some other helpful ability attached to them. Notably, a lot of them added power to the cards in your center stage, so they were better backstage support. This is also where we started to see the concept of repeatable Brainstormers, which didn't need to rest, but if you added a card to your hand with them, you also had to discard. That said, there were still sets being printed whose only Brainstormers were, subpar to say the least, and many titles would still have to wait to get a good one. In 2015 though, there was a card that came out that was just a cut above the rest. Beyond the Walls Aaron was the first Brainstormer printed in English to rest only himself and be able to search for a character instead of doing something like draw, add power, or something else bad like getting cards from your clock and then clocking yourself, and have another good ability. He also gave your center character plus 1k on your turn, and he was a strict upgrade from the only other Brainstormer of the time which rested itself to salvage, which was in Persona 4, and one of the first big power spikes in brainstorming. Now in 2016 into 2017, you saw a mix. There were sets that were still coming out with Rest 2 Brainstormers that had some other ability, and plenty of sets with no shortage of bad, borderline unusable ones. You saw a lot more sets that had repeatable Brainstormers in conjunction with other good ones though. And now, more sets like Idolmaster and the newer Love Live sets had tap self-searching and salvaging Brainstormers just like Aaron. Titan Set 2 also introduced a new Brainstormer, giving the set a tap self-search and tap self-salvage Brainstormer for both sets. And the 2016 set, Love Live DX Volume 2, featured a myriad of Rest Self, Rest 2, and repeatable Brainstormers. Though by 2017, while Rest 2 Brainstormers were still the norm, you did see some Rest 1s in the mix and some Brainstormers with newer abilities. For example, this Kirito from SAO Re-Edit was a Rest 2, Draw 2 Ditch 1, and this Aqua from Konosuba, which rested herself, let you put a cost 0 character on the stage from your waiting room. It also gave the character in your center stage hand encore, so that was pretty interesting. Further, Titan was given a blue Beast Titan Brainstormer that could salvage 2 cards for 1 climax, but only salvage cards called Predation Titan, making it the first enemy faction Brainstormer. And this is also where we started to see Brainstormers that milled 5 instead of 4, but only if you played certain climaxes. This Cosme from Bang Dream only worked with 2 climaxes, but again, she milled 5 instead of 4. She also gave your characters plus 500 when you played either of those climaxes, making her the first Brainstormer that had a climax combo attached. Soon after, in 2018, a few other Brainstormers who had climax combos attached followed, like Nia and Viral from Gurren Lagann, and Eve from the next Bang Dream set. Each of those were clearly, by design, meant to be played in their own specific meme deck though. Nia was actually a special Brainstormer that instead of looking for climaxes, looked for an enemy faction level 0 which you could run any number of in your deck, but then only allowed you to search 1 character no matter how many you hit. Excel World Infinite Burst also kind of had a meme Brainstormer that, for each climax, lets you search out and play an enemy faction character from your deck directly. So these meme combo and enemy faction Brainstormers were starting to become more common. It was around 2018 that most sets that came out now featured at least 1 Rest Self-Search or Salvage Brainstormer, and also added them to some older titles. Sunshine got one, Bang Dream got one, heck, even terrible sets like Fate Apocrypha and Excel World had them now. Konosuba even got a Brainstorm that didn't even need to brainstorm. It was just resonate with your finisher, top check 4 and add a character. Not technically a Brainstormer, but the decks that ran it used it as a strict replacement for any alternative Brainstormer, and for good reason. And later into 2018 and the early 2019 months, you really started to see the decline of the Rest 2 Brainstormers. They still existed, but at this point it was pretty rare to see them played. In Bang Dream Girls Band Party Volume 2, we had the first level 2 Brainstormer printed in a long time, but she also happened to be a level assist. This meant that you didn't have to choose between a level assist and a Brainstorm for one of your back row slots. Though this one did have to rest 2 characters, so it kinda defeated the point. But after this point, rest 2 Brainstormers got rarer and rarer. In Goblin Slayer, there was an elf that only worked with a certain 2 climaxes just like those other set package Brainstormers, but this one actually milled 6 instead of 5. Though no matter how many you hit, you could only salvage 1 character. Bushi was kind of playing around with that profile. Also in Goblin Slayer, Cowgirl got the first climax combo printed on a tap self-salvage Brainstormer. If you played the standby climax, you could pay 1, bounce her, and stand something on your stage. This let you swing in with your standby target that turn, and also clear a spot for them, which was pretty ideal. This probably would have been a lot more powerful if standby Goblin Slayer wasn't so fucking bad. However, now at the start of 2020, we had an established precedent for Brainstormers that was a lot different. First off, most sets were now expected to have at least 1 main Brainstormer that was fairly deck agnostic, and that was tap self, and that had a good ability attached to it, which could possibly be a climax combo. If Rest 2 Brainstormers were printed, it was expected that they would deliver something pretty good, or grant some kind of utility special to a deck, since of course they were more costly. And by now, pretty much all the wacky Brainstorm effects like add 2k power or add 1 soul for each climax you hit were pretty much gone. They just weren't being printed anymore, and while the supplementary effects of these new generation Brainstormers were getting stronger, so too were their actual Brainstorm abilities. For example, this Aaron in Slime, for each climax you hit, let you top check 3 and add any card, now enabling your Brainstormer to dig deep for climaxes. This was in the same set as a Rest Self-Salvage Shuna, yeah, say that 10 times fast, that could give something minus 500 power on play, killing off a lot of the smaller runners and bombs before they could generate any value. Additionally, a new kind of Brainstormer started to come out in some sets, where instead of working with climaxes of a certain name, it only worked with climaxes with certain triggers, but it also rewarded you for playing that specific trigger with supplementary abilities that were very powerful, like for example, adding +1 soul when you triggered a gate. And after that, Rest 2 Brainstormers virtually fell off the map for the rest of 2020, as did repeatable Brainstormers, since they just weren't a popular choice anymore. However, while Rest 2 Brainstormers were now a very rare breed, they would make a brief comeback in 2021. In Day Day Live, Bushiroad printed the first Rest 2 Brainstormer that was competitively played in years. This Toka was a Rest 2 Brainstormer that, on climax play, bounced back to hand and gave a character +1k across turns. This is pretty similar to the Cowgirl Brainstormer from a year ago, but without her own climax combo to stand something. However, the big difference was that the Day Day Live standby deck was fucking monstrous, and we learned fast how broken this ability on a Brainstormer could be when it was put in a good standby deck. It was so good that it would later be one of the first cards in English to ever be restricted as a choose one of 3, which came out in response to the Day Day Live standby deck absolutely dominating the field. But if you compare the Toka and the Cowgirl Brainstormer from the year before, you can kind of see why it's tough to judge cards in a vacuum. Plenty of Weiss Schwarz cards have profiles that are incredible, but no cards that take advantage of them. But after Toka, that was pretty much it for Rest 2 Brainstormers. They did occasionally come back for specific decks where they only worked with 2 specific climaxes, but they milled 5 or 6 instead of the usual 4, or had some variation that made them better than the old Rest 2s. But like I said, by 2021, they were incredibly rare to see, and after Day Day Live got the ban hammer, you pretty much never saw them in competitive play again. However, abilities on Rest Self Brainstormers continued to get better. For example, how about a Brainstormer that lets you draw one and pitch one when you play a climax, and lets you play climaxes without meeting their color requirement? This led to some hilarious shenanigans with standby decks where you didn't even run red. Bofery, the set that introduced that, also brought us this 1/1 Brainstormer where you could pay 2 and Brainstorm to salvage a climax. Yep, it was finally here. Brainstormers existed that now could salvage climaxes. Sure, this one was terrible, even back then, but you know this meant that eventually they would get better. But Brainstormers in general still got better. With the advent of Hololive, a staggering amount of quality Brainstormers were added to the game, and none of the 15 different new Brainstormers in Hololive were Rest 2, except one Brainstormer which happened to be on a level 3 back row assist. There were some that helped their own specific packages and characters, and they gave those cards amazing power boosts and useful abilities, like this Sora, who's a Brainstormer that you can also pay 1 to send her to the waiting room to encore a character, which then gets +3k power until the end of the next turn, which is incredibly potent since Sora has a powerful anti-soul level 3 early change package that you definitely want to save if it died. Hololive also introduced for the first time an unrestricted deck-agnostic Brainstormer that milled 5 instead of 4 and searched for any character. The catch was that if you had 1 or less cards in your clock, you couldn't stand her. Also, thanks to Hololive, it was now normal that any Brainstormer that had the draw card ability would mill 5 cards instead of 4, since it was considered a lot less desirable than searching or salvaging. A month or so later, on a completely different front, Tokyo Revengers introduced something pretty unique. This level 1 pay yen let you pay 1 and Brainstorm 3, and then if you saw any of these level 2 Pachins, you could put 1 from the waiting room onto your stage for free. And these Pachins can get up to 16k with 2 pay yens on stage, and pay yen can shuffle 2 of them back into your deck on play. Tokyo Revengers has been using this combo to set up a board of 16k bodies, which is pretty dumb to play against. Now this isn't really a Brainstormer in the way you'd expect, but it was a big shift in what the Brainstorm mechanic could even do. And believe me, we're in for more of this nonsense in the very near future. Jumping back a bit though, do you remember those Brainstormers I mentioned that only work with certain triggers? Well, Quince 1 and Konosuba had some of these, but Quince 2 had some that were just on another level, like this Iski, which only works with gate triggers but actually increases your hand size by 1 for each one on the stage. So yeah, imagine playing 8 gate with a hand size of 9. It's pretty disgusting. Ichiga also got a Brainstormer in the set that was the first Rest 2 Brainstormer played since Toka, but she had another ability where you could sack her and top check 4, so she was a very strong mill card for the new standby deck. But we're about to see something a lot more interesting. Titan, the final season, finally came out in 2022, and with it, a new Armin Brainstormer, which was the first card to have 2 Brainstorm modes. You could either pay 1, rest him, and for each climax you hit, salvage a character, or pay 2, rest him, and for each climax you hit, salvage a climax. Oh yeah, a level 0 Brainstorm with 2 different rest self abilities, one of which can salvage climaxes. Now 2 is a lot of stock, but being able to combo off even if you didn't draw your climax is priceless sometimes, and you don't even need to run an extra card to do it. Armin is truly a Brainstormer that's built different. But he wasn't the only first of 2022. Dragon Maid also introduced something new, a level 2 Brainstormer that was the first repeatable plussing brainstorm effect. You can pay 1 and salvage Brainstorm as many times as you can pay for it. Now, it's not extremely playable, and Dragon Maid isn't exactly a powerhouse of a set, but I'd wager that we'll soon see a stronger version, just like we saw a drastic jump from the Beaufree Climax Brainstormer to the Titan Climax Brainstormer. And finally in 2022, 7 Deadly Sins Volume 2 came out, and with it came 2 of what are now the cutting-edge Brainstormers of Weiss Schwarz. First, we have Elizabeth, Trust in the Promise, who's a rest self salvage Brainstormer with a Climax combo. It's a stock soul that lets you mill 1 and salvage 1 character whose level is equal to or less than the card you milled. Now, effects like this have existed before on some Climax combo Brainstormers, but none so playable as Elizabeth. STS in general can get away with running a split Climax package, so being able to add 2 of the stock souls and off Climax is incredible. You basically get to plus every turn you play a Climax, but believe it or not, she's not the craziest Volume 2 STS Brainstormer. No, this, as of the making of the video, is the newest and wildest Brainstormer we've ever seen. Elaine revived as a Climax combo, but no one cares. Her Brainstorm effect is that you rest her, sacrifice a character, and then Brainstorm to top check 3 for any card with each Climax you hit. But rewind, nowhere in that ability did I say you pay a stock. That's right, Elaine has become English's first stockless Brainstormer. She digs through your deck at literally no cost, letting you add Climaxes or characters you find without paying a single stock. Now, you do have to sacrifice a character, but in Weiss Schwarz you have a lot more cards in your hand than cards in stock, and it's a precious resource. Being able to brainstorm without paying stock all game opens up a lot of resources that you can do other things with, like brainstorm even more. The world's pricing STS decks for 2022 ran 6 or more Brainstormers, and would easily brainstorm several times in a turn. Having played this deck with both Brainstormers, it's incredible how they can take you from a do-nothing turn to a game-closing hand. Both Elizabeth and Elaine are truly powerful cards, and they're the perfect way to cap off this video about Brainstormers. Now, we showcased a lot of cards here and talked a good deal about what was played and what wasn't, but at the end of the day, all I wanted to do was impart on you players just how much cards have changed in Weiss Schwarz through the years. And it really is every kind of card, from level 0 tech to Brainstormers, advantage combos, early plays, and finishers. Heck, even Climaxes got better. In the next installment of this video series, I'll pick a different kind of card and show you its rich history as Weiss Schwarz moved through the years. Players, I hope you enjoyed this little trip through time. For older players, maybe you got some nostalgia, and for newer players, maybe it gave you some insight on how things used to be. Or if you're an old and knowledgeable player, maybe you saw a mistake I made in the showcase, or you know a Brainstormer that I missed. Tell me in the comments, but for now, it's time to wrap up this video and move on to the next one. And as always, thanks for watching. Peace.